It's loading, and now I should be preparing the live.
Yes, I got a notification that it's live streaming.
Yeah. Okay, good. And to mute myself, and we're nearly there. Connected. Okay, go live. Why can't I press it? Sorry, technical issue.
No worries.
It's fine. One, okay. Okay, I see myself live, but it's not saying it's live.
Oh, well, I have both live and YouTube, the little indicators, so I don't know.
Okay, I guess I'm live on my channel, not exactly on the same link.
Okay.
Let me find that. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so sorry. I put the volume down. Sorry. We're going to start. Sorry for the little delay. So, welcome everyone to the second session of the Grand Multi-Literacy event. And now I have with me the pleasure to have Professor Catherine McBRIDE to talk about dyslexia and multilingualism. So good morning, Professor McBRIDE, and thank you very much for accepting my invitation to be part of the Grand Multi-Literacy event.
Good morning. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to introduce you a bit. If you feel like you want to add something else after, feel free to do so. But you're a professor of human development and family science and associate dean for research for the College of Health and Human Sciences. You're the former president of two organizations devoted to literacy research worldwide that are called the SSSR, so the Society for Scientific Study of Reading, and the ARWA, which is the Association for Reading and Writing in Asia. You're also the author of 2 books and editor of 6 books and author of over 270 journal articles, all on literacy learning and impairment across cultures. So I'm very honored to have you today to talk about dyslexia and multilingualism. Is there anything you would like to add for the...
I think I would like to add that thank you very much, but I'm at Purdue University in Indiana in the US, and that's why I said good morning. And I also was at the Chinese University of Hong Kong in Hong Kong for 26 years before this. So
yeah,
that's kind of the background.
Thank you very much. And so the first time I got to know you, it was mainly because I read one of your articles, I think, about dyslexia with children who had 2 very different languages, that had English and Cantonese, and that piqued my curiosity, and also about the fact that we're going to talk about it later, but some children were not dyslexic in both languages, and that surprised me. So I'd love to talk about this with you today. But to start with, could you explain what your research entails and what got you interested in this area of research?
Sure. So my research mostly focuses on cognitive linguistic aspects of reading and writing across cultures. So that's useful, and that's basically behavioral tasks. I could just tell you, some of the tasks right now, they're not invasive in any way. They just involve talking to the children. And the reason I'm interested in these tasks is because usually if you have such tasks and they're reliable and valid, they can be used to identify people who are at risk for reading difficulties. And by people, I mean young children, actually. And also those cognitive linguistic tasks are often good indicators of what you could train if you were wanting to facilitate children's early reading. So it is possible to use such tasks to identify young children who are really at risk for having reading problems, even if they aren't reading yet, and then to try to train them so that they don't end up having such reading difficulties. So that's a lot of my research. And the way I got into it, I think I got interested first when I was 20, and I was in a student practicum where I was in a school for kids with learning disabilities. And there was this one little boy, I still remember him. He was really so funny and creative and cute and just so clever. But I could not believe that, and that was on the playground. But when he was in class, he couldn't read anything. And I found that this does not compute, sort of. It seemed so strange to me. I didn't know anything about dyslexia, but I think he started me getting interested in that. And yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. And you mentioned that you can start diagnosing children who are quite young, like even before they can start reading. How young were they?
Yeah, so this is possible, and different countries and different cultures have different approaches to this. So it's important, especially to talk about Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is unusual even across Chinese societies in how early children are exposed to reading and writing. So they start to get homework in both Chinese and in English when they're 3.5 years old.
Oh, wow,
it's really early. And in the rest of mainland China, in Taipei and other places in Taiwan and Singapore, it's usually more like 5. So Hong Kong is very early. But in Hong Kong, around ages 3 and 4, we can give them some tasks that are associated with subsequent variability in reading. So we can kind of see that. I think it's better if you do it later. If they're 3 and 4, there's a lot of variability, but it's still possible. By 4 to 5 or 5 to 6, it's pretty. I think it's more stable.
Okay. Now, I guess you don't start testing every child. Why do people come and see you, or why do you try to assess certain children more than others?
Well, I did a lot in Hong Kong because Hong Kong is unusual, as I said. So by age 6, so in Hong Kong, there's a school of there's a kindergarten school. I think this is similar to other countries in East Asia. So there's first, second, and third year of kindergarten. And then they go to primary school when they're 6, but they've already had 3 years of school.
Yeah.
So it was important to, so I should also say when they're 6 and they're not doing well, they're already very behind because they've had 3 years of school.
Yeah.
And so that is why in Hong Kong, it became pretty important to try to identify children when they were 5. So we have the Dyslexia Early Screening Scale that we helped to create in Hong Kong just to find those children early. Because the later we wait, and this is true across countries, the later that dyslexia is detected, the more difficult it is to remediate.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So I guess we're going to talk a bit more about this in depth a bit later. But I wanted to ask you a question because as a teacher, so I teach also French and Spanish in a secondary school in England. So French and Spanish or foreign languages, they start to learn it at 11. But there are also students who are dyslexic in English. But I see that when I teach them Spanish, I don't really see any mistakes or I don't see any mistake that others don't do. But when it's in French, I see quite a lot more. And I always thought it's because Spanish is a lot more transparent. So in my head, it's that it's logical. You have one sound after the other. But in French, it can be a combination of letters and that form one sound. And I thought that was the main reason, but are there other reasons why like these students who are dyslexic who could show more things about dyslexia in French than in Spanish?
Right. I think that's a great question. One thing that I want to mention at the beginning is, at least traditionally, we really talk about dyslexia only in the first language or the dominant language.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because, if you're learning a language later, there can be all, as you know much better than I do, there can be all kinds of reasons why somebody's not doing well. It could be
Yeah, it could be just
motivational or
yeah.
other aspects, or they're just not getting that kind of input. But if it's and it's tricky because in multilingual households, it's hard to say what the first language is, but this definition and the way people have thought about dyslexia really did sort of it originally came from German, but in the last 40 years, it's more like focusing on English. And so there it's really talking about the first language. So I'm just saying that as a general idea that is important to keep in mind. I do think it's important to think about reading difficulty in a second or foreign language, especially from the perspective of Hong Kong Chinese children and learning English, because there are so many people in different countries who have to learn English as a second language. And if they don't do it well, they're at risk for their job, the jobs they get, or the education may not be as high. So that's the first thing I want to say. And I know it's kind of getting away from what your question was, but when we're comparing Spanish and French, I think that your explanation is the correct one based on research that I've seen. So there was a paper comparing like 20 or 30 different European languages in the early 2000s by Philip Seymour and a lot of other people, where they showed that Spanish is among the most regular, and then therefore, at least by native Spanish speakers and readers, the most easily read, whereas French is very much in the middle. English is pretty much at the end of alphabetic languages in terms of how long it takes to learn to read, but French is in the middle because of what you said. It's not as transparent. There are different ways to show the same sound. It's just not as regular. And there are studies also from Canada by Linda Siegel, for example, who look at, kids who are dyslexic in English compared to, and some of these kids are dyslexic, are determined to be dyslexic in English as first language learners. But some kids are also classified as dyslexic or poor readers, but they speak English as a second language. And what they find is those who learn English as a second language, but know how to read or speak another one, tend actually to not have as severe a problem.
Oh, okay.
And that's interesting to me because I think English is so irregular and French is somewhat irregular, whereas Spanish is
really regular.
Yes.
So okay, so that can compensate and help then. Okay, and so I'm going to come back on your experience with children in Hong Kong, because you stayed there for 26 years, so I guess you know very well how it works for them. But I remember reading that, so one child, I guess it's for several, but one child was dyslexic. I can't remember in which language, but in one language, so maybe English, but not dyslexic in Chinese. And I was wondering, so these two languages are very different. So English has deep orthography. Chinese, you have to learn all the strokes, and there are thousands of characters to remember. For the brain, is it the same process to learn to read, or is it quite different? Is that why some children are affected by dyslexia in one language but not the other?
This is a great question. And I mean, I guess one of the answers is we still have to do more research on it. And it's complicated because it probably depends on the method of teaching and other aspects. So I think fundamentally, when we talk about how children learn to read, no matter what language or script we're talking about, there are three aspects that are very important. One is phonology, or how the speech sounds. So I think if you're a foreigner listening to a language you don't know, you can tell that those speech sounds are different than in another language, and you start to distinguish them. So that's kind of the base level. And then usually we're mapping meaning or semantics or morphology onto phonology. So that's another level, which is, so you tell me a syllable, like lie. What does lie mean? So you start to you start to process, oh, this is how it sounds, but this is what it means. And then the third aspect is orthography, or how it's written. And we just talked about how English is somewhat irregular. Some of the sound, like the letter P, or no, let's say, it's kind of funny that psychology is spelled the way it is, starting with a P. It's linked to many. There are many reasons, but it's a funny way of writing it. You wouldn't have come up with that as an English speaker usually. And in Chinese, I think anyone who, you've seen Chinese characters before, they look really complicated and intricate. And so I think for a native Chinese speaker, you need to know about 2,500 to 3,000 characters. And on the face of it, they all look very different, right? So the patterns are different. And in English, you have a lot of that as well, but it's only 26 letters. You have to memorize some patterns. Some of them are irregular, like O-U-G-H. Sometimes it sounds like though, and sometimes it sounds like enough. So it can be different, but there's a lot more variability in Chinese. So is the brain doing the same thing in reading both? I think it's always making use of a combination of these patterns of phonology, morphology or semantics or meaning, and orthography. But how much there has to be an emphasis on one versus the other depends on the orthography.
Okay.
I've seen a lot of research studies that emphasize how difficult English is compared to French or Spanish or German in reading. And that's all true. But Chinese compared to English is much more, it's not very phonologically based. It's much more complicated to learn to read. So that's just the beginning. But I could go on and on about this because there are other variabilities that you have to take into consideration also.
I understand. And so I would like to just ask you some details about one aspect you mentioned about the fact that they don't learn the language in the same way in different countries. And you also, so when I presented you, I said, what did I say? So it was, you study literacy but across cultures. So how does this impact on the way we learn to read?
How does the culture impact? I mean, I think, again, Hong Kong is a good example, and it's an extreme example, but in Hong Kong, at least traditionally, things are changing gradually, but the language that people speak in their daily lives is Cantonese. But the text that children read is basically Mandarin. It's basically Putonghua, common language. It's so there's a difference, even in grammar, and of course in pronunciation and things, between Cantonese and Mandarin. And so the other thing about learning in Hong Kong has been that children, usually the way they learn to read is that they map a character onto Cantonese, a Cantonese syllable. However, in other places like Taipei in Taiwan, they're using Mandarin, but that's what they speak. on the mainland, people may also speak other dialects or languages, but in school it's always Mandarin. In Hong Kong, it's Cantonese. The other thing is in both Taiwan and on the mainland and in Singapore, when characters are being introduced, they are introduced via a phonological coding system. There are at least two that are very popular. One is called Juyin Fuhao, and one is called Pinyin. And they're both a very simple way of showing how to pronounce the characters using symbols that are either the Roman alphabet, that's Pinyin, or some similar symbols, which is Juyin Fuhao. So that's a very different style of teaching.
Yeah, I understand, yeah.
But there are other things too, like I think in the UK, children are taught letter sounds, but not letter names right away. Whereas in the US, they're taught letter names, and then later they associate those with the sounds. The age at which children are taught, for example, at least traditionally in Sweden, you didn't even start doing any kind of literacy learning till you were 7, which is much later than other places. So there are many variations, yeah.
But so regarding the age at which they start, I understood that the older they start, the quicker they can progress. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's true. I think the reason some children start so early, though, like in Hong Kong, is because they feel like there's so much for the children to know, they should just start this early. I think starting at that age is not very efficient, because 3- and 4-year-olds, they don't have a lot of attention or patience for this kind of thing.
Okay. And so we have a question. I'm not sure I understand the question, so I'm going to read it. Let me know if you understand it. So how do you decide which language you should have as a starting point when starting to map out the dyslexia in a multilingual family? And she says, mom and dad speak different languages, family living in a third country. So there are 3 languages.
Okay, so that's a great question. And I think it's possible to speak all these languages, but not read all of them. So I'll give you an example. I know somebody who's now in his 30s in Los Angeles in California, and his mother is a Chinese speaker. He always spoke Chinese. It was his first language, but he never learned to read it. He learned some when he was 18. Before that, he really didn't read and write Chinese at all. If we're talking about 3, say, Indo-European languages, some of that question is, related to priorities of the parents and how much you want to emphasize one over the other. I'd say from just a cognitive linguistic perspective, pick the one that's the most transparent. So German is easy to read because, and when I say transparent, I mean that the letter always sounds the same. There's not this kind of variation as there is in English. So German and Spanish are the most, French is in the middle, English is at the end. So learning to read the most transparent one first does seem to help children to read more confusing.
So it's a good starting point to start with the most transparent language, but we need also to take into account what's relevant for the child and the family, I guess.
Exactly, because dyslexia is defined as a problem in reading words.
Yeah. It's
word reading. And word reading in some ways is very simple. Like if you think, once you get to ages 8, 9, 10, reading comprehension is what is important. But of course, if you can't read the words, nothing else matters. You're not going to get that far to comprehension. But, for multilingual families, for everyone, meaning is the most important in a lot of aspects. Dyslexia is a specific difficulty.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to put my parents' hat. So I taught my 2 sons to read and write in French and Korean. And also I'm thinking of teachers who who work in dual immersion schools. So before you said that, so dyslexia might affect one language more than the other. If, for example, in the school language, the child does not show any sign of dyslexia, how can I be sure as a parent that in my language, home language, there is he or she is not dyslexic? Is there any sign I need to look for?
So again, dyslexia is usually just diagnosed as the home language or the dominant language in the culture that you're in. But if you're, so I just have to be careful about that. Every culture defines dyslexia a bit differently. I would say that one of the most important things to do with very young children is to try to do some language play. Like in English, we have this silly thing called Pig Latin, where it's dumb. I don't know why it's called that, but you're supposed to play. Do you know what Pig Latin is?
No.
Okay, so if you get a word, like a one-syllable word, you take the rhyme of the word and then you say that first, then you say the first sound of the word second with A at the end. So cat would be at K.
Okay.
Dog would be og day.
Okay. Wow. Okay, that's a lot of mental gymnastics.
It's a lot of mental. Or rhyming, or making up rhymes, or just making up silly words. If children have a lot of trouble with that, they are likely to be more at risk for dyslexia. So, I mean, what the example I just gave you is fine. Another way to do it in any language is to take either a word or a phrase and ask children to maybe take a syllable away from it. So like cowboy without saying boy should be cow.
Yeah.
You could do that also but in that case, both of those, it's a compound word. You could also say candy without D is can, or anything else. So I'm just saying those examples, this is something you can do in any language to see if children are capable of those kinds of things. But of course, at age 3, I wouldn't worry. By age 5 or 6, if they cannot move syllables around, that might be some indicator.
Okay. And when you gave this example, so I'm an adult, and so I probably see things differently than a child. But when you're saying candy, you remove the D, I could see the word in my mind, and just taking away the D. Is that how? So I guess that's not how children learn when they can't read yet. So what's the process in their mind? Is it just based on sound, or
should be
is there more?
Based on sound? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And yeah.
Oh, well, it's sort of interesting just to think about the letters of the English alphabet, which are similar to like French or Spanish, but that the letter sounds are learned differently in English because of the structure. So like letters where the sounds start the name, like B, are learned first. Those that end the name, like L, it ends with L. Those are learned a little bit later. And then ones that have no association, like in American English, H is just pronounced H. Doesn't have anything to do with the sound. That's different in British English. Yeah. But those are very difficult for children to learn. And it's because of, these connections of sound.
Okay, so I guess it's easier to teach a child to read just by pointing at the sound, saying that's L instead of L, or that's.
I think it may be. Yes.
Okay. And so we often hear that so it's a misconception, but some teachers sometimes say to families, don't speak your home language to your child at home because otherwise they're going to be delayed, etc. In terms of, so that's a myth, and we shouldn't advise this, but I'm thinking now in terms of literacy, if some languages are more transparent than others, and for example, one letter, so it fits two languages with the Latin alphabet, and we take the J, for example, in Spanish and English, it's not pronounced in the same way. Would that confuse the child, or is it just a learning curve? Or what's your perspective on this? So should we teach both languages at the same time, or just prioritize one and then the other?
This is a great question. And I think part of it is just a practical issue. You have to think about what is expected, because the standards of schools and what children have to learn, most parents cannot control. I do think there will be some confusion, but it's in this respect, like reading and language are nothing the same. I mean, they're really, reading is effortful and boring. Speaking and learning through communication is just a normal act in whatever language. But in this way, I think language and reading are similar in that there probably will be a bit more confusion for a little while for a multilingual child, but they get over it pretty easily. Yeah. So I think it's worth it. And one study we did was in an international school in Hong Kong, but it was in Hong Kong, but the international schools in Hong Kong teach in English and then also teach Mandarin as the second language. And when they do that, they also use Pinyin, which is a Roman alphabet system to help children to learn to pronounce the characters. And at the beginning, that school was very concerned about this same question. Like a P in Pinyin does not sound the same as a P in British or American English. Okay. And so they were worried about whether they should teach it or not. And it ended up being the case that the children were not too confused. However, I still recommended against teaching Pinyin because Pinyin is simply easier for children to read rather than to look at the Chinese characters. So that was a confusion, but the children didn't initially have the problem that the teachers were worried about. They didn't confuse them too much.
Okay. And I just thought about it afterwards, but I guess it's the same as when we learned that the letter G can be pronounced J or G. It takes some time to learn it. So it's in the same language, but there can be some confusion between, do I read J or G here? The same as when we see the words in Spanish or English, we might not know if it's H or J. So
right.
Okay. And so I would like to ask you quite open question. You can take it the way you want, but it's a sentence that I heard a lot, and I believe in it as well. But it's we only learn to read once. So with your research background, do you think that how true do you think it is?
I think it's very untrue. I don't I don't see that. I guess because I mean, I'm not a multilingual speaker, but I have learned for a couple of years anyway, some French, some German, and some Chinese.
Yeah.
And I feel like in all of those instances, I was reading and I was learning new symbols, new ways to, depict the words. I still get very confused. I was trying to spell sehr in German yesterday on Duolingo, and I forgot if it was S-E-H-R or Z-E-H-R. Like, no, I think, and especially the contrast between English and Chinese, I think it's a very different way of looking at symbols on a page. So I'm not sure what that means. If that refers to reading comprehension, I think there's a lot more similarity when you get into the deep issues of reading comprehension.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really specialize in how to look at, words on a page, how to spell them and how to read them. So in that case, no, I disagree.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Last question I had is, when I grew up, I went to an international school, and I had Japanese and French. So it was in France, so French for most subjects and Japanese. And I remember that the students who were learning to read, so younger year groups, for all the languages that are not Latin based. Sorry, I start again my question. So, for example, the children who had Japanese and French, they were learning both at the same time, and the logic was that they are so different that there is no way to confuse them. But for example, those who are in the English section or Spanish section, etc., they learned it with about quite a few months difference, like 6 month difference, where they would learn to read in French first and then in the other language, because there was this risk of confusion. But that was nearly like 35 years ago. So I guess things have changed, but would that be still a good way to go about it or not?
This is a great question. I don't have a good answer for that. I don't think, like, I mean, whether 6 months matters or not. I mean, all I know is that there will be some confusion at the beginning.
Yeah,
But what I really worry about is teaching children to read too early. I've seen that a lot in Hong Kong. You have most children that, they have to learn English. Their first language is Chinese. They have to learn English from age 3.5 until they can leave school at 15. But I would say the majority of kids there don't end up being able to speak English really, because English is such almost an albatross. It's like it's taught even to 4-year-olds as CAT spells cat. It's not used to communicate
yeah,
or really, like, you could do a play, you could do songs, you could enjoy English and English movies and those kinds of things and speaking. But the way it's taught as a foreign language is really only about reading and spelling. And
okay,
if there's one thing I would really like to communicate is language and reading are very much overlapping in some instances. And as adults, we have trouble distinguishing them. But for a young child, you can start to use the language and see, the use of it, be motivated to use it, see how it's associated with some fun things. But actually reading and writing it, I think, should come a bit later, whatever the age is, it would be better to have some foundation in why it's useful as a communication mode before you start to read and write.
yeah. So to make it more relevant, fun, and therefore it's relevant for the children, because just learning CAT equals cat, what's the purpose of it? I can decipher it, but it's not helping me. So yeah, okay, I'm making relevant for the children so they want to learn it.
That's right. And so for your question, when do you teach it, like a year apart? Or I guess the older the kids are when they start to read and write, I mean, if they've started to read some language already, that a first language, some kind of language in school that's being taught to the children by 6 or 7, that seems like a good time. But for
Okay.
reading and writing other languages in school, yeah, 7 or 8, as long as they have that basis for
Okay.
understanding why they should care.
Yeah. Okay. That's very informative. Thank you. Is there any last word you would like to say? Something that you want everyone to really remember or to know about whether dyslexia or literacy in general?
Well, we started out by talking about how maybe it could be possible to be dyslexic in one language and not the other. And I've tried hard to say, like, standard tests of dyslexia usually assume that that's your first language, whatever that means. But
Yeah.
I've been interested in this because when I was giving talks to teachers and parents in Hong Kong, a lot of times the parents would tell me that they were switching their child from one school to another because of the script. So there would be local parents whose kids are speaking Cantonese, but who were having so much trouble reading and writing in Chinese so early that they decided to switch them to an international school, which meant a different medium of instruction. It meant speaking English.
Yeah.
And that really piqued my interest. And that's why I did studies on it. And I showed that it is possible to have much more difficulty in reading one, like Chinese, than the other, like English. But what I didn't realize was that the first study on this had been done in the year 2000, a long time ago. And I always thought the reason for this, is because in Hong Kong, Chinese and English are taught so differently, and they have so many things that are different, script and everything. That's why. But the first study was of dyslexic kids who are dyslexic in Swedish, learning English as a second language. Okay. And what it found was that the same thing there. The dyslexics in Swedish seemed to prefer English much more. They were doing better in it. And they weren't sure why. But part of it really had to do with motivation. And subsequently, I've found out about studies even in German and English. So if you're learning to read in a second language, there are other aspects of it that are important. So what I'd like people to keep in mind is there can be different cognitive aspects of learning to read in one language and not another. Yeah. But there can also be motivational ones. And so if it seems that the child is having real trouble in reading one language and not another, there are different angles that you can consider to try to understand that.
Yeah, that's an important thing to remember. It's not just about the technical aspect. It's also like, are they motivated? Do they see why it's useful for them? Yeah. Thank you. I think we're going to finish with one question that we have from someone on YouTube. So would it be easier if you were context-based? So I think it's going back to how to teach words, because you're saying that in Hong Kong, they was just saying C-A-T-E is cat, so out of context. So would it be easier if you were context-based to get the understanding and then pinpoint certain words and analyze them? So, for example, maybe I'm guessing telling a story where there is a cat and then trying to find the word cat in the text and going that way.
So it's a good question. I have two parts to my answer. Yeah. One is that maybe you've heard of this in a lot of English-speaking countries right now. There's this whole debate about science of reading. It's not a debate. It's actually people are really focusing on the scientific aspects of reading. And I think there are a lot of aspects to that. That's why I was talking about phonology, meaning, and orthography are all important for reading. But one of the basics is understanding the phonological aspects. This doesn't apply as well to Chinese, but it applies pretty well to most other scripts. Yeah. And so it's important to teach that stuff in isolation. And so, but that's getting at the word part.
Yeah.
So you cannot skip that, because other people have said like, oh, these stories are boring. We are not going to talk about the fact that T sounds like T. We just are going to skip it. It's too boring for children. And I think the idea from Science of Reading is you have to do that, because it's a good tool for children to try to decode. Yeah. But the other aspect is, yes, context is important and meaning is important. I think there's a model called the simple view of reading, which talks about how reading comprehension is you have to be able to read the words on the page, but also you have to be able to understand the language. Everything with syntax, inferences, who's who, vocabulary. If you don't have both of those, you will not be a good reader. So you must have both. And so the second part is, I think, more important than the first. Okay. Dyslexia is more focused on the first, which is recognition of words. Yeah. But yes, I think context in terms of just deriving meaning. Why am I reading this? Like, stories are interesting and or I'll learn something new from this language experience is fundamental.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and it helped me see as well a bit better. Like, for example, as I said, I thought as well that you only learn to read once, and then it's just applying the same context to different languages. But yeah, thank you very much. That was very insightful. And so for those of you who following us, if you want to learn more about what Professor McBride's work is, I'm going to leave the link to her website in the description below. So feel free to check it. And in about 30 minutes, a bit less, we're going to have Dr. Bialystok, who is going to talk to us about the cognitive benefits of multilingualism. So thank you very much again for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And have a nice day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.